America's B-1B Lancer, often referred to simply as the Bone, is not only the fastest bomber in American service, but it's also the heaviest hitting, with a maximum payload that outstrips even the B-52 at a jaw-dropping 75,000 pounds. This supersonic monster was originally meant to fly deep into Soviet territory with fighter-like performance, but today, America's 45 remaining Lancers are living on borrowed time, repeatedly grounded as issues arise with their aging airframes and onboard avionics, and already slated to be replaced by America's forthcoming stealth bomber, the B-21 Raider. And while the B-21 does promise to be the most advanced and broadly capable bomber that this world has ever seen, it'll still never be able to match the B-1B's immense payload or its high-speed performance. But then there was once a plan to not only upgrade the B-1B for an extended service life, but to make it so much more than it is today. That proposal, called the B-1R, would have equipped the Lancer with powerful new engines ripped straight out of the F-22 Raptor and its own bevy of air-to-air missiles, while nearly doubling its top speed and giving this massive jet the means to hunt for and destroy any enemy fighter that flew its way. And if you ask me, aviation does not get much cooler than a gigantic fighter, screaming across the sky at better than Mach 2, slinging missiles at encroaching fighters, while carrying more than 3 school buses worth of bombs in the back. So let's talk about the defunct B-1R proposal, what it could have been, and how America could, well, really use a bomber like the upgraded Bone today. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is Air Power.
Fox 1.
The Lancer's supersonic roots can be traced all the way back to the 1960s, when stealth was little more than an experimental concept tucked away in Army R&D projects, and the prevailing wisdom of the day called for flying higher and faster to increase the survivability of your aircraft. Now, this line of thought was directly called into question in 1960, of course, when the CIA's Gary Powers was shot down over the Soviet Union and a U-2 spy plane flying at around 70,000 feet up. But the subsequent success of the A-12 and SR-71 Blackbird, which combined high altitudes with record-breaking speed, seemed to be enough to hinder effective targeting. The B-1A began to officially take shape in 1969, with the intent of building a heavy payload bomber capable of performing fairly short sprints above Mach 2, with the goal of dashing quickly past heavy Soviet air defenses near the nation's border before reducing speed inside the nation's interior to deliver its nuclear payload. Of course, airplane buffs already know how this story ends. In 1977, Jimmy Carter took office, and the new B-1 bomber program and its rapidly growing cost immediately drew his ire. Over its 7 years of development, the B-1A's projected cost had ballooned from $40 million per jet in 1970, which is about $336 million today, to a reported $100 million per airframe, or more than $543 million in today's currency. The rising costs of this effort were then compounded by renewed concerns about advancing Soviet fighter radar capabilities, which would make the B-1 more vulnerable even during its supersonic sprints. And then, the proverbial nail in the coffin really came in the form of the AGM-86 air-launched cruise missile. This new air-breathing nuclear weapon was powered by its own turbojet engine. With a 1,500-mile range, the already in-service B-52 could theoretically launch these nukes from well outside the reach of adversary air defenses, allowing the missiles themselves to do most of the really dangerous flying as they closed with their targets. And behind closed doors, we now also know that Carter's administration was aware of a burgeoning and highly classified effort to field a new kind of bomber, one that relied on stealth rather than speed, and that could potentially turn the strategic bomber mission on its head. And of course, the advent of nuclear-armed intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, and submarine-launched ballistic missiles, SLBMs, had led many, both inside the Carter administration and even within the Defense Department, to question the continuing value of even building heavy payload bombers at all. So Carter canceled the B-1 bomber program just 5 or so months after taking office, and the program stayed mostly canceled for about 4 years until Ronald Reagan took office on the promise of, among other things, strengthening America's military. Within a year of Reagan taking the White House, the Air Force awarded Rockwell $2.2 billion, roughly $7.4 billion today, to build 100 new B-1 bombers, but with several notable changes to the aircraft's design and operational intent. Rather than prioritizing high-altitude sprints, the new B-1B would prioritize scorching speeds at low altitudes, where the air is a lot more dense and high speeds are a lot tougher to accomplish. The new B-1B would also take pains to reduce its radar return, incorporating radar-absorbent materials and a new air inlet design that also happened to negatively impact the platform's top speed, dropping the B-1B's high-altitude max to Mach 1.2 rather than the B-1A's Mach 2.2. The new bomber design was faster than the B-1A at the low altitudes it was meant to fly at, and was reportedly capable of breaking the sound barrier at sea level, whereas the B-1A couldn't muster much more than Mach 0.85 at that same altitude. And according to the U.S. Air Force, these changes reduced the aircraft's radar return by a factor of 10. In fact, despite being 3 times longer and 10 times heavier than an F-16, the Lancer offers a reported 1/5 the radar return of the original F-16A. That means the B-1B Lancer is arguably only slightly bigger than Russia's Su-57 on enemy radar screens. Structural revisions also made it possible to increase the bomber's takeoff weight by around 82,000 pounds, making it possible for the bomber to take off with a full 75,000-pound bomb load and a full tank of fuel, with 48,000 gallons, or around 200,000 pounds worth of jet fuel in its wing and fuselage tanks. All of that onboard fuel gave the B-1B an unrefueled combat radius, or the distance it can fly out to deliver ordnance and still return without a top-up, of more than 3,400 miles. And in order to maximize the utility of this new bomber for conventional or non-nuclear strikes, 6 external hardpoints capable of carrying a combined 50,000 pounds were also incorporated into the design. These improvements resulted in a bomber that, according to the Air Force, now holds nearly 50 records for speed, payload, range, and time to climb for its class. And while this impressive performance would never actually be used to deliver nuclear weapons, and its nuclear capabilities were stripped away in 1994, this all allowed the Lancer to go on to become an extremely valuable airstrike and close air support asset throughout the global war on terror. Its incredible payload capabilities and large fuel stores made it possible for B-1B pilots to loiter over combat zones for extended periods of time, providing persistent support for troops on the ground. And when another unit called for help, the Lancers combined 123,000 pounds of thrust under afterburner allowed it to sprint to wherever it was needed. I'm going to quote Major Coyote Laney, a B-1B pilot instructor from the 28th Bomb Squadron that I interviewed back in 2019. I remember in Afghanistan, where troops needed help across the entire country, and I could go 1.2 Mach all the way there and still have enough gas to hang out when I got there. So you could take a platform that's on the east side of Afghanistan, and 15 or 20 minutes later, I'm showing up when there's no one else for several hundred miles that could help. Now, according to Boeing, America's small fleet of B-1B Lancers has flown more than a combined 12,000 sorties since 2001. But the bones value in these combat operations that it was never really designed to fly have come at a cost, with airframes racking up hours and, as a result, just generally wearing out. By 2019, 34 years after the Air Force took delivery on its first Lancer, roughly half the fleet was down for maintenance or repairs at any given time, and at some points, as few as just 6 B-1Bs were considered available and ready for combat operations. In fact, while the Air Force has retired plenty of B-1B airframes in the past, parts for these aircraft are so expensive that 2 of them have been unretired and pulled back into active service as replacements for other bombers that were damaged and just ruled too expensive to fix. And I can actually speak to at least some of that immense cost thanks to a brief trip I took a few years ago to the GE aviation facility responsible for producing the turbine blades for the Lancer's F-101 GE-102 afterburning turbofan engines. These blades are produced using massive, severely outdated machinery that does nothing but sit, collect dust, and occupy space when not producing limited orders of these components for Lancer repairs. And as anyone with any experience with lean manufacturing or Six Sigma, or even just ordering parts online can tell you, limited production runs of anything that require specialized equipment and personnel working at intermittent intervals dramatically drive up the cost of production. And the B-1B is certainly no exception. As a result, the Lancer is now America's most expensive bomber to operate, with its per flight hour cost reported in 2022 as roughly $173,000 per hour. That's $20,000 per hour more than the B-2 Spirit and more than twice the hourly rate of the B-52. Of course, the high cost of Lancer operations didn't come as a surprise to the Air Force, who were already exploring options to deliver more payloads to combat zones in the Middle East by the early 2000s. With only 21 B-2 Spirits in service, the bombers were just too rare, too expensive, and too specialized to be the primary means of delivering warheads to targets in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan, where there were no real air defense threats for the Spirit to befuddle with its pricey-to-maintain stealth capabilities. Now, lots of options were explored here, including an F-22 Raptor-based strike fighter concept that we've previously covered, called the FB-22. But among the most promising had to be a Lancer upgrade that would give the B-1B a big boost in capability in exchange for a slight reduction in range, effectively turning the strategic bomber into a regional one, and thus the name B-1R, with that R standing for regional, was born. One of the biggest changes the B-1R would have seen over the B-1B would have come in the form of a serious engine upgrade. Boeing proposed swapping the Lancer's GE-sourced F-101 turbofans out in favor of new Pratt & Whitney F-119s, the advanced 5th-generation engine designed for the most powerful fighter in the world at the time, America's F-22 Raptor. This change alone would make for a huge bump in the bomber's performance. The B-1B's 4 F-101s produced a combined 69,560 pounds of thrust while running dry, and as much as 123,120 pounds of thrust under afterburner. Now, 4 new F-119s would increase those figures to a mind-boggling 104,000 pounds of thrust dry and an otherworldly 140,000 pounds with its afterburners lit up. But more than just adding a bunch of power, these newer and more powerful engines were also each roughly 500 pounds lighter than the F-101s they'd replace, for a combined 2,000 pounds in weight savings to coincide with that big boost in power. And it's really important to note that the inclusion of F-119 engines would have had greater implications than just increasing the aircraft's top speed. Like on the F-22 Raptor, people often tend to glom on to the incredible max afterburner power output of these engines. But part of what makes the F-119 so incredible is the amount of power it produces without its afterburner engaged. The truth is, aircraft don't fly with their afterburners at full tilt very often because, well, one of the unfortunate side effects of just dumping a ton of fuel into the outflowing exhaust stream of your engine is that it uses up a lot of fuel. In the F-16, for instance, a pilot can burn through every drop of its internal 7,000 pounds of fuel in under 5 minutes at full afterburner, which, you might note, isn't really enough time to get much done. And in terms of non-afterburning power, those 4 new F-119 engines would produce so much thrust, you could literally strap a fifth F-101 to the bomber we have today and still fall short of matching its power output. As a result, it has been reported that the B-1R would have been capable of supercruising, just like the F-22, or flying at sustained supersonic speeds without needing to keep its afterburners lit. Boeing's B-1 and B-2 general manager at the time, Scott White, openly claimed these changes would allow the Lancer to reach the top speed of its own canceled predecessor, the B-1A, at Mach 2.2, though doing so probably would have had to come with changes to the aircraft's inlet design that may have resulted in a more detectable bomber on radar screens. It's really tough to say for sure. Rather than conducting supersonic sprints, these more powerful engines would allow the heavy bomber to cruise at speeds above Mach 1, which would have made it far more effective at covering wide expanses of territory, while also coming with a roughly 20% penalty in overall fuel range, bringing its unrefueled range down to around 4,700 miles, depending on the source that you trust. But of course, mid-flight refueling would allow the B-1R to conduct long-range bombing missions as necessary, just with a bit more logistical support than today's B-1B needs. But while these new engines would have given the B-1R a big boost in performance, an avionics upgrade and changes to its external hardpoints would have allowed this bomber that already looks like the world's biggest fighter to, well, fight like a fighter as well, thanks to the added ability to carry and launch AIM-120 Advanced Medium Range Air-to-Air Missiles, or AMRAAMs. Now, in order to put these weapons to good use, the B-1R's avionics upgrade would have included a new radar array, swapping out the original APG-164 navigation and weapon control radar in favor of a more modern and much more capable active electronically scanned array system. A handful of sources even specifically cite the Raytheon AN/APG-63V3, which was in active development at the time, entering production a few years later in 2007. Now, this would have given the B-1R the same powerful targeting capabilities found in America's air superiority-focused F-15Cs and Ds today, while also improving its terrain mapping and following capabilities and a whole lot more. In fact, incorporating an active electronically scanned array radar into the bone is actually one of the proposed B-1R upgrades that actually did find its way into the Lancer fleet, but about a decade later. Rather than the APG-63V3, however, the Air Force ultimately opted to install the Northrop Grumman-sourced Scalable Agile Beam Radar Global Strike, or SABR-GS system, derived directly from the AN/APG-83 radar array found in America's F-16s starting in the 2010s. Boeing's team was a bit more nebulous about other avionics upgrades the B-1R would receive, but an emphasis was clearly placed on increasing network connectivity, because the branch was already transitioning toward what we now usually call kill webs, that distribute the steps of a kill chain, or the steps of a successful airstrike in this context, across multiple networked assets for speed and especially for redundancy. But regardless of the specific system changes, the end result of the B-1R modification would have seen America's Mach 1 bombers turned into massive Mach 2 fighter bombers. This incredible aircraft would have been able to outrun any American fighter except the F-15 and F-22, would have been able to outhaul the payloads of any American bomber, and could have gone on to become an air-to-air arsenal plane for forward advancing stealth fighters in the same way today's F-15EX aims to operate, except the B-1R would have been able to carry much larger payloads over much greater distances, likely at much higher sustained speeds. In the Air Force's 2050 report, they outline a pretty daunting vision of the future of air warfare, one where long-range precision strikes from ballistic, cruise, and hypersonic missiles make operating from forward air bases a thing of the past, and where surface-to-air missiles with 1,000-mile ranges make it impossible for tanker aircraft to keep American fighters in the fray. As a result, the Air Force now believes that the future of air power increasingly looks less and less like highly capable fighters with relatively short ranges, and more like big bombers capable of covering thousands of miles without refueling while using advanced avionics to engage targets both in the air and on the ground. And if the Air Force does have its way, America's air power apparatus is on the verge of fundamentally changing the way it goes about designing, procuring, and especially operating combat aircraft, with the B-21 Raider now increasingly expected to serve as a multi-role bomber, capable of not only closing its own kill chains against ground targets, but also bringing air-to-air missiles to bear against adversary aircraft. The Air Force has even openly acknowledged that they're considering the transfer of some of the air superiority mission to the B-21 as a means of bringing down the overall cost of the nation's next air superiority fighter in development, currently known as the Next Generation Air Dominance Fighter. So, while the B-1R program never took off due to concerns about costs and the downtime associated with modifying the entire Lancer fleet, we are now looking toward a future that would certainly benefit from such an aircraft. And this is honestly something that we see pretty often in the strategic balancing act that is defense. Today's trends begin as niche sentiments shared by a small group of analysts and policymakers, and as those sentiments compete with others to become the dominant philosophy of the day, proposals emerge built around each of these competing mindsets. The same long-range strike capability the B-1R was proposed to fill in 2004 also saw people calling for an F-22-based strike fighter, a B-2 upgrade program, a drone bomber based on the X-45, a blended wing body arsenal plane packed with, quote, over 100 hypersonic missiles, and even conventionally armed intercontinental ballistic missiles. Now, each of these potential options represented a burgeoning air warfare paradigm that, in time, could become the cornerstone of the future force. But because we can't see the future, the best we can do is, well, it's the best we can do. And while the B-1R might come in handy today, I think it's fair to assess that the B-21 Raider will be even more useful when it enters service at the close of the decade. So that poses the question, does that make the B-1R a missed opportunity or a stepping stone toward the still emerging future of American air operations? Well, I'm personally inclined to lean toward the latter because the B-21 does have a great deal of potential, but I still have to admit that really only time will tell. And with that ends yet another edition of Air Power from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure you swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and now merch from all around the force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below, and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.